Got one. Steely Dan.
No.
Yes, absolutely. No, in terms of pure musicianship, I would put them up against any current band you can name.
You wouldn't know any current bands.
That's besides the point.
Have a good day, honey.
You too.
Boss Skaggs. There's another one.
Oh,
Whoever they are, bye. Thanks for breakfast.
bye.
You're welcome. Listen, tell Lewis to drive carefully, will you?
All right.
Our son doesn't know who Boss Skaggs is. We have failed as parents.
Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. You've been listening to the music of Drew Zingg. That was called One Off. It can be found on his self-titled solo album, which he released in 2012. Before that, we heard the great Heisenberg expressing his affection for both Steely Dan and Boz Scaggs to his unreceptive son in a scene from Breaking Bad. Just don't know about this younger generation. I thought it would be appropriate to play that clip, considering the close association my guest today has with both of those classic artists. I've been looking forward to speaking with him about his connection to them, and of course, about his outstanding debut solo album as well. Joining me on the phone from Long Island, New York, is Drew Zingg. Welcome.
Thanks. How are you doing?
Doing great. Well, a lot of our guests come from musical families where pretty much everyone they're related to plays one instrument or another, but I understand it's not the case for you. You were the only one in your household bit by the musical bug, at least to the extent of seeking a career in music. So when did you become aware that music was going to be more than just a passing thing for you?
Well, that is true. My brothers, I have two older brothers, and they were great fans, and they were actually great music and audiophiles from the time I can first remember. And, the big thing was, of course, for anybody that's about my age, the Ed Sullivan Show with the Beatles was a big moment in my life. And then I was, I guess, 6 years old when that show was on, and I picked up the guitar at that point. And I just played all through grade school and high school and through college, and then, just getting more and more serious with it, and decided I'd give it a shot. after I left college.
You've cited Jimi Hendrix, Pete Townsend, and Carlos Santana as some of your earliest influences. So while your playing has gone on to incorporate jazz elements, is it fair to say that your roots are as a rock guitarist?
Definitely fair to say that, yeah. I mean, I definitely went through a period in my late teens where I dove into jazz as much as possible, but I always consider myself like just basically a rock and pop guy trying to, to get in that other pool, as opposed to, I think there's a lot of musicians that come the other way, that start off as jazz players and might get more into the heavier thing. But I was definitely from the rock element and the pop element.
Was it a question of listening to Wes Montgomery, people like that, and sort of trying to incorporate their thing, or was it even conscious?
Oh, it was definitely conscious. It was like, it was just like the next step. One thing I didn't really want to go into was, really shedding high-speed, technically fast rock guitar. That was something that never really appealed to me. So, the other side of the coin was more of the advanced harmonic thing, and so I consciously did kind of self-teach myself and dove into the jazz thing as much as I could.
Yeah. So you targeted it. You said, I want to do this. I'll make an effort to do it. It wasn't like you were playing and slowly jazz sort of licks sort of flowed in. You said, I play this way. I want to play this way. How am I going to get from A to B?
Yeah, actually, think of it. One of the gateways for me, there are two gateways, which are kind of strange when I think about it. I heard Charlie Parker when I think for the first time when I was like about 18. And to me, he was like so soulful that it was like blues or rock and roll. And to me, just because his tone was so great, and he was just so musical that to me it almost didn't sound like what I consider jazz to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the other guy that was kind of a gateway for me was Django Reinhardt.
Yeah.
Same thing. Like, I wasn't really into the classic jazz guitar players like Wes and Charlie Christian at first, because I just didn't really associate with that tone, which is kind of mellow. And but, to me, Charlie Parker and Django sounded to me like a rock and roll guy. Especially there's some recordings with him, electric guitar, and it sounds like he's playing a Strat. They just put a pickup on his acoustic Macaferry, but it's just blistering stuff. And I thought, wow, if those guys affect me that way, then maybe I can kind of get into the jazz thing through them.
Yeah.
And I was always transcribing solos, and those two were big ones for me.
Well, they're two masters. And since we're talking about, types of guitars, your main guitar is a 69 Gibson 335, which has served you well in the fine-tuning of your musical voice. When did you acquire that guitar?
I actually got that in the late 80s. I guess I was in my late 20s. And I bought it from a friend, secondhand, for, I don't know, $250. And it's just, it's not a particularly beautiful model. I mean, it's a brown guitar. It's not the most, coveted year or anything. They tend to be like late 50s or early 60s, and people like really nice sunburst or cherry red.
Yeah.
And this is not that. And I've played a lot of 335 since then. It's special somehow, and I don't know what it is exactly, but some guitars are just different, and this one has always spoke to me.
It's interesting how that happens when somebody just gels with one particular instrument. I'm glad that you happened to grab that one in the late 80s. I'm sure that it's been, I've seen you play other guitars, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that is, you would have to call that your main guitar, right?
Yeah. I mean, as a gun for hire, I always try to play as many different styles and as many different guitars as possible. But that's always, when I have my chance to, I'll always reach for that guitar. And,
I don't know if it would have been the late 80s, but I know some of your earlier pro gigs were with singer-songwriter type acts who I presume were mainly interested in brief solos, if at all. And given your prodigious soloing talent. Did you ever feel constricted in that environment?
I think I did to a certain extent, although the older I get, the more it's kind of a dichotomy, I guess. I'm not that interested in endless soloing, believe it or not. I mean, maybe some people would accuse me of that, or I sound like I am. But even if I'm playing a jazz, quote unquote, jazz fusion gig, I don't really like to solo, endlessly. I try to get what I have to say out, and as quickly as possible. But yeah, I think it's, when I was in my late 20s, and there is kind of a burning desire to figure out what you can accomplish and what you want to accomplish. And there was definitely a period there where I was like, I wish I could be playing more experimental music. I don't know if I feel that way so much anymore, but...
Yeah, it's not right or wrong for them to ask you to do that. It's like I had a situation in the 80s where I was able to play keyboards and guitar players were common and keyboardists were hard to get, so everybody wanted me to only do that. And I took one of those gigs for money to pay off some gear, and I felt very unsatisfied because I felt like only half of my trip was being used. They only needed half of it, so that's what I was kind of driving at. It's like you knew you were capable of more, they didn't happen to need it, and that's fine. But so you did kind of feel like this is. I'm sure that you learned, as we'll talk about, with some later gigs, it benefited you to know how to play in that context. But because you are so gifted as a soloist, it seems like a shame. I'd be disappointed to go to a gig you were at and never hear you really do your thing. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, but it's funny. Now that I think of it, since you brought it up, I've always kind of been on both sides of the equation. I've really enjoyed like Chet Atkins, for instance. I'm a big fan of his, and he would just play the simplest thing and just do one chorus. And there's always been that side of my interest. So I've kind of, even though there might have been a time when I wanted to really stretch out a lot, there was also, at that same time, I really enjoyed playing concise, musical statements.
Well, back in the early 90s, a keyboard player you worked with named Jeff Young befriended Donald Fagen, and they started playing some casual gigs around town, which eventually evolved into the New York Rock and Soul Review, for which Fagen hired Jeff's band, which included you, to play classic soul tunes behind himself and guest artists like Michael McDonald, Boss Skaggs, and Phoebe Snow. A few Steely Dan songs were included in the set, and I'm wondering if you think it was the audience's reaction to that material that got Donald, assessing or maybe reassessing the viability of reforming Steely Dan.
Absolutely. I mean, I think he was kind of laying low throughout the 80s. I know that, he has said that himself that he had some kind of, a little bit of a writer's block. And he didn't really, the Night Fly he had recorded in maybe 82, and then didn't do too much. I know he did the soundtrack to Bright Lights Big City, and there's a song on there. But I think he just wanted to get out there and, start playing. And I think he was encouraged by his wife to just get out there and start doing gigs. And that, I think, was the original thrust of the Rock and Soul Review, just to play tunes, just get out there and play. And basically, kind of what he does with the Dukes of September now, which you may be familiar with. It's a review of old tunes. But, of course, so he did a couple gigs like that, actually before I think I did maybe a third or fourth of those gigs. But, and he did a few gigs where there were no Steely Dan tunes. But people were just kind of, I think, very happily surprised to see him out there. And they kind of were demanding, they were just would love to hear him sing. First of all, he didn't sing, I don't think, at all. Maybe he sang one tune. Then he tried singing a tune, and people loved it, and I guess he enjoyed it. And then he might sneak in one Steely Dan song, and people, of course, went crazy. And then 2 and 3, and eventually it became pretty much like the Dukes of September is now, which is maybe a third Steely Dan tunes, or a third pop songs, and a third old R&B chestnuts.
Yeah,
but yeah, that's I think gave him he felt comfortable enough.
So it was a process. I'll perform. I'll just play. I won't sing. Now I'll sing,
Yeah.
but not my tune. You know,
Right,
I'll sing
exactly.
Ruby Baby or something. Now I'll sing my tunes. It was a gradual thing for him. It's
Yeah,
funny
it's a
because
gradual thing.
his history is he's always been a reluctant singer. He never wanted to sing ever.
Right, that's true. He didn't want to be the lead singer of Steely Dan originally, and he was kind of voted into it. But and then the same thing with the tour. We did a tour. First, we recorded an album live at the Beacon Theater, and then there was talk of a tour. And from what I remember, Walter and Donald didn't have. At that point, Walter had joined the Rock and Soul Review, and they didn't have very pleasant experiences from their tours in the '70s. I might be speaking for them here, but they were like, "Well, I don't know if we want to do that." And I think at that point, the business had changed enough, the touring business, that, various people, including their managers, were like, no, touring is different now. It can be fun, and you'll be headlining. So we did a tour, I guess it was 92. And I think they realized that they could do that at that point as well.
Yeah.
And they really enjoyed it. And then that morphed into the reformation of Steely Dan.
What I'd heard, their two main gripes about touring in the 70s was, number one, the quality of the sound systems, because these guys have really high standards, but it wasn't just
Right.
that. They did a gig in England where there was just feedback through the whole show. It just
Right.
really upset them. And then the other thing was Walter apparently really hated to get up early in the morning, and in order to keep on schedule and catch the next gig. So the combination of having to get up early and then having these sound problems just soured him on it and then drove him into the studio.
Yeah. But
Taurus,
I think everybody was like, after that first Rock and Soul tour, it was like, wow, this is actually could be fun,
Oh, yeah.
Especially, the way they do it now. I think they fly by private jet, and
It was much different.
they do it up. They do it right now.
Most guitarists either go with a clean or a distorted tone, but there is a middle ground between those extremes that I would characterize as a clean tone, but with an awful lot of bite to it. And I think your playing pretty much epitomizes that sound, which also happens to be the trademark of the Steely Dan guitar solo. So I'm sure when you performed that material live with Donald Fagen, it wasn't lost on him what a perfect fit you were for his tunes. Did you alter your playing in any way on his material, or is it just like business as usual?
Well, it's interesting because, like I said, I had recently acquired the 335, and I had listened to their records throughout my adolescence and early 20s, so it's really, really familiar with it. Although I hadn't been an avid devotee of all the guitar playing, but it seems like, to me anyway, a happy coincidence that was my axe, because it kind of fit in with their music.
When I say alter your playing, what I mean is, you're playing a Jackie Wilson song, and then you're playing a Temptation song, and here comes Greenflower Street, or here comes something of Donald's. I'm going to make an effort to be extra good on this, or was it just all the tunes you did your best on all of them? I'm sure, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Were you conscious of it?
Well, actually their tunes have to be a lot of fun to play as a guitar player.
Totally.
Because it's blues based, but it's harmonically advanced, and it's just a lot to sink your teeth in. So especially solo wise. So there is that part of it that it's just fun to do.
You can't help but sail on their stuff, huh?
Right.
Well, let's pause and listen to a sample of the New York Rock and Soul Review. This is a Steely Dan classic everyone's going to recognize. We'll pick it up from the final verse and then listen to your soloing through the playout. Here we go.
Cross the square, act natural, like you don't care. Turn slowly and comb your hair. Don't trouble the midnight air. We're standing just where he stood. It was chain lightning, it feels so good.
So after hearing that, it's understandable why you were invited to participate in that first Steely Dan tour of the 90s. What were the main differences for you between the sort of all-star cover band aspect of the Rock and Soul Review musical environment versus this full-blown Steely Dan experience where it was billed as Steely Dan, the audience was Steely Dan fans, all the material was Steely Dan? I mean, what were the differences from your point of view up on stage?
Well, it was good for me that I had done the rock and soul thing previously, because if I had just been asked to do that Steely Dan tour, out of the blue, I don't know how I would have handled it, because I was a big fan. But having played the last couple of years with Walter and Donald, I felt a certain amount of comfort. But I guess the big thing was, there was a certain amount of attention given to it because they hadn't performed in a long time.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing. I mean, and we did play Madison Square Garden, which I guess it's the only time I played there, and that was, a pretty big deal.
We should mention you are a New York native. You're born and raised in Manhattan, so
yeah.
You don't have the Bugs Bunny accent, but
I know. What's up with that?
Well, when you guys came through Phoenix on that tour, I was in the audience, and when you guys came out and just played that overture before Walter and Donald had even come out, I mean, I knew I was in for a great night of music. I mean, right out of the gate, you guys has established that the standards were going to be very high. And what I remembered about you specifically, beyond just, all your healthy musical chops, was your body language when you played was sort of unique. Is that something you do unconsciously, or is it kind of a showman thing?
Oh, I try to avoid any. I mean, I don't know. I think maybe I was a little more excitable when I was younger, but I try to. I don't think about a show really. I'm just trying to play the right notes. Not look too stupid.
Well, you didn't look stupid. You looked like, it looked like it was, what I'm wondering is, we'd mentioned Pete Townsend earlier, and he developed a sort of windmill technique.
Right.
And first it was for show, but then it worked its way into his actual compositional content. He would actually write to playing that way. So I was wondering, it wasn't like you were, it was anything, like Joe Cocker up there, he looks
right.
kind of like spastic. It was like, you just looked like you're moving with the music, and I was wondering if you felt like it affected your actual sound, or you think if you just stand still without a lot of upper body movement, you sound the same? Because I think it probably does affect it to the better, how you play.
I think it does. I mean, I really think, I think music is, it's an oral expression of the physical body. I mean, I think music is about dancing in some sort of way. And, I've thought about that actually. If you're physically moving in a certain way, it's kind of hard to play out of time,
Yeah,
and
that's true.
It does basically help you get in some kind of groove. And I've talked about this to other musicians. A friend of mine, Richard Patterson, the bass player, once recently actually said, look at the way people dance, and that's how you can kind of get a good pocket. Look at a good dancer, while you're playing. That helps too.
That's interesting.
So all those things I think are related. Yeah.
I also think of Stevie Wonder with his head movements,
Right.
The way he rocks his head. It's part of it's getting into the music, and part of it is, like you say, a pocket and having a groove and a feel. Well, you mentioned that was their first tour in a long, long time. And of course, all the true Steely Dan fans were perfectly content just to have Walter and Donald play their songs. That's enough for us. But,
Right.
At the time, some of the more, let's say, asshole-ish reviewers, they were commenting on their supposed lack of showmanship by calling the tour the Drew Zingg Show. And see, now if I was you and I heard that, I'd be telling them, hey, I'm sorry, guys, but secretly I'd be thinking, Drew Zingg Show, hell yeah,
Luckily, I didn't see that.
Yeah, I only caught it one place. Somebody called it the Drew Zingg Show. And, whatever. I mean, everybody on stage was awesome. And anybody who could find fault with the show, Walter is not doing handstands and Donald Fagen isn't doing karate moves and stuff. Nobody cared who went to see the show. They're back on tour. They're performing all the greats. Everybody loved it. And somebody always has to, the turd in the punch bowl. But because they specifically singled you out, and I think it was part of it was we were talking about you're more animated. Maybe they're trying to say Walter should be more like you. It was just they just grabbed your name, and I just thought, I'd be thinking, Steely Dan, Drew Zingg Show.
Reviewers are funny. I guess.
Yeah. Well, it's nothing to do with you. You didn't write the riff,
yeah.
but and they probably never even heard about it. But I'm just saying, as if I was you and there was all those musicians on stage and they said it was a Drew Zingg show, I'd be going, hell yeah, it's a Drew Zingg show. Oh well, let's.
Yeah,
just,
I didn't catch that, but
yeah.
you know, and I'm sure there was different reviews. So
Yeah, and those guys sort of insulated from that. They have the sort of if they can tell that a reviewer is clueless and they can figure out pretty quick, and they're known for this.
Right.
You know,
Right.
if Walter says the best album they ever did was Kind of Blue, and the person doesn't know what he's talking about, you know, then they're not going to take it seriously. But
right.
well, I want to pause again and listen to a sample of your playing with Steely Dan. Another of their many classics. Almost everything they did is pretty much considered a classic at this point. This one's from the Asia album. And again, we'll join it already in progress right before the solo section. Let's check this out.
Danger on the rocks is surely past. Still I remain tied to the mast. Could it be that I have found my home at last? Home at last. Home at last. Thank you.